I remember the sound of the machines. Those constant beeps, sometimes reassuring, sometimes more urgent, were part of my daily routine. After 10 years of working in the neonatal ward, I thought nothing would surprise me anymore. But that day, everything changed. Ethan. I remember the name clearly on the little card attached to his crib. He was so tiny, with golden curls and eyes that seemed to take in the world around him. From the moment I first held him, something inside me changed. The first few days were a mix of hope and anticipation. Every time the phone rang, I thought it might be his family, but no one called. No anxious mothers, no nervous fathers, just silence. While other babies went home, cradled in the loving arms of their parents, Ethan's crib remained empty. As time passed, he began to become more than just a patient to me. I felt my heart clench every time he held my finger, with his surprising strength for someone so small. At night, after the shifts had quieted down, I would sit beside him, quietly telling him stories, even though I knew he wouldn't understand. It was a silly habit, but I couldn't help it. "They'll come, honey," I whispered one night, gently stroking his cheek. But deep down, something told me no one would. Doubt was turning into certainty. The discharge papers remained untouched. The efforts to locate his guardians met with closed doors. The thought of him entering the foster care system kept me awake at night. He deserved better. He deserved love, security, a family. I knew I was crossing an invisible line, the one that separates nurse from person. But that night, as I held him in the nursery, something inside me snapped. "What if it was just the two of us?" I whispered, my voice sounding more to myself than to him. It was the first time I had allowed the thought to take shape. And after that, he never left me. Adopting Ethan was not a decision I would make lightly. I considered everything: my modest home, my routine, my income. Could I provide for him? I knew it was a lifelong commitment, something that would change everything forever. But as I held his tiny hand that night, the answer seemed clear. I couldn't leave him. Ethan was not just an abandoned baby. He was mine. Thus began a journey I could never have imagined, but which would become the most important of my life. Taking Ethan home was the happiest and most terrifying moment of my life. I remember the day like it was yesterday. I stood in the hospital parking lot, holding him in the infant carrier, my heart pounding so loud it felt like everyone around me could hear it. The house was ready. I spent nights decorating his nursery with a jungle theme. The walls were painted a soft green and had little stickers of giraffes, elephants, and monkeys, something that made me smile every time I walked into the room. Everything seemed perfect, until that moment, when the door closed behind me, and I realized that now it was all up to me. Ethan was so small, so vulnerable. When I first laid him in his crib, he made a contented sound, somewhere between a gurgle and a laugh. It made me laugh too, a laugh that seemed to release all the tension that had built up over the past few weeks. The first few days were a whirlwind. I found myself checking his breathing as he slept, even though I knew he was fine. The nights were long, and the days were shorter than they should have been. I remember one specific moment, sitting in the rocking chair I had bought, especially for his room, holding him in my arms as he slept. The house was silent, except for the sound of his soft breathing. "I will always protect you, my love," I whispered, kissing his forehead. And it was true. He brought a new light into my life, something I hadn't even realized was missing. Before, my world had revolved around work and long shifts at the hospital. Now, my world was Ethan. Still, it wasn't easy. There were doubts, moments when I wondered if I was doing enough, if I was good enough to be his mother. Every laugh from him, Every curious look felt like a small reminder that I was on the right path. I remember the first time he called me Mommy. He was still learning to speak. His words were jumbled. But that sound, Mommy, my eyes filled with tears, and I laughed, hugging him so tightly that he giggled. The years passed too quickly. Ethan grew before my eyes, transforming from a curious baby into an energetic little boy. He loved to draw, spending hours doodling animals and landscapes in his notebooks. But even with all the happiness, there was moments when I felt a tightness in my chest. Questions I knew would come one day, questions he deserved to ask, but I didn't know how to answer. For now, I tried to focus on the present, on each moment we shared together, because deep down, I knew that no matter what the future brought, I would always be his mother, and he would always be my son. It was an ordinary afternoon when Ethan's question came, unexpected and full of curiosity. I was in the kitchen preparing dinner when he walked in, that serious look on his face, his big, piercing eyes fixed on me. "Mommy, do you know who my real parents are?" he asked, his voice low, as if he feared the answer. My heart stopped for a second. A wave of surprise and a pang of guilt went through me. I knew this day would come. I knew he would start to wonder, to make connections. But even then, I wasn't prepared. I put my spoon down on the table and crouched down to be at his level. His face was so serious, but his eyes were empty of an answer, as if he was searching for something I couldn't give, something I didn't have. "My real parents, you mean? The ones who gave me life?" I asked softly, my voice trying to sound calm, but my heart was racing. Ethan nodded, the expression on his face still so mature for someone his age. "I know you're my mother, but I want to know more. How did I get to the hospital? Why didn't anyone take me home?" The question was simple, but the words cut deep. I could feel my entire body tightening. The silence between us felt too heavy. I had always known that one day he would want to know more. I wanted to understand where he came from, why those unresolved issues hung over us, but I wasn't prepared for how it would hit me. I sighed, trying to gather the strength not to let my insecurity show. "I don't know much about them, Ethan," I said, choosing each word carefully. "When you were left at the hospital, no one came looking for you. I don't know who your biological parents were, honey. All I know is that you needed a home, and that's what I tried to give you." He looked at me intently, his dark eyes reflecting a confusion I didn't know how to dispel. "But why didn't anyone want me?" he asked, the pain in his voice nearly breaking me. Why did they leave me there? The question made my stomach churn. How to answer that? I didn't know. The truth was, I didn't have the answers, only guesses, and even though I'd tried to give him everything I could, I knew it wouldn't be enough. He deserved to know. He deserved to know who the people were, who had left him behind, how he'd really gotten to me. "I don't know, Ethan. All I know is that when you got to the hospital, I knew I couldn't let you go into the system. I saw you, and I knew you were mine. Not by blood, but by something stronger, something I didn't even know existed." I hugged him tightly, feeling his small hand tighten on my shirt as he processed the words. I could feel the weight of the questions he would ask in the future. I might not have the answers now, but I was willing to seek them out for him. But deep down, I knew that nothing would change the fact that he was my son, and that, in the end, was all that mattered. After that conversation with Ethan, something inside me shifted. I realized that I could no longer ignore his questions, could no longer go on living without at least trying to find the answers. He needed to know where he came from, and I needed to help him understand. I spent sleepless nights sifting through the few documents I had, rereading each piece of paper with obsessive attention. Among the old hospital records was a name I had never noticed before: Marilyn Collins. She was listed as an emergency contact. Maybe it was nothing, but maybe it was everything. The next morning, after dropping Ethan off at school, I sat in my car and took a deep breath, staring at the address I had written down. I didn't know what I would find, but I knew I had to try. The neighborhood was quiet, with houses lined up neatly, each surrounded by small gardens. When I pulled up to the house, I had indicated my heart was pounding. It was a simple house with large windows and a welcoming porch. I hesitated for a moment before getting out of the car. I walked up the steps to the porch, my heart racing, and knocked on the door. A few seconds later, it opened to reveal an elderly woman. Her pale eyes studied me warily, but there was something familiar in them, something that made me swallow hard. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice soft but cautious. "My name is Selena," I began, trying to sound more confident than I actually felt. "I'm looking for information about a boy named Ethan. Do you happen to know him? Richard or Anna?" Their names came out in a nervous whisper. Her eyes widened and her expression changed instantly. She gripped the door tighter, as if she needed support. "Ethan?" she repeated, her voice shaking. You mean my grandson?" I froze for a moment, but then I nodded slowly. "Yes, I think he's your grandson. He was left in the hospital 10 years ago, and I adopted him." Tears filled Marilyn's eyes, and her hand shook as she brought it to her mouth. For a moment she said nothing, just stared at me, emotion evident in every line of her face. "My God, Ethan," she whispered. "I thought I'd never hear from him again." She invited me in, and we sat in the small living room. There were old photographs on the walls, one of which caught my eye immediately. A young man with eyes that looked just like Ethan's. "Is that Richard?" I asked, pointing to the photo. She nodded, dabbing her eyes with a tissue. "Yes, my son. He and Anna disappeared." Her voice trailed off, and she took a deep breath before continuing. "They left letters for a while, but then everything stopped. I never knew what happened to them." I explained to Marilyn how Ethan had been left at the hospital and how I had adopted him. As I spoke, her eyes filled with tears again. "He's a wonderful boy, Marilyn," I said sincerely. "I love him like my own son, but he's starting to ask questions. He wants to know where he came from, and I want to help him find those answers." She nodded, holding my hand tightly. "You're an incredible woman for taking care of him. He was lucky to find you." Her voice was thick with emotion. "But please let me meet him. I want to see my grandson." I nodded, feeling the weight of responsibility in every word. I knew this was just the beginning, that finding Marilyn was an important step, but that there was still a long way to go. Ethan would finally have some answers, and perhaps together we could learn the rest of his story. I sat at Marilyn's kitchen table, a cup of tea in my hands. The soft aroma was a contrast to the weight of what we were about to discuss. Marilyn stood across from me, her slender fingers drumming against the edge of the table, her gaze lost somewhere in the distance. She seemed to be organizing her words before she spoke them, like someone putting pieces of a puzzle together. "Richard has always been complicated," she began, her voice low. "My son was brilliant, but restless. He never quite knew where he fit in the world." There was a tenderness in her tone, but also a deep sadness. Her hands shook slightly as she took an old photograph from a small frame on the shelf beside it. In the picture, a young man with light eyes smiled beside a beautiful dark-haired woman with a shy smile. "That's Richard, and that's Anna," Marilyn said, pushing the photo toward me. "They were so in love, but also so unstable." I stared at the photo, trying to find traces of Ethan in their faces. Richard's eyes were similar, the same curious sparkle, but also a certain melancholy that I couldn't ignore. "What happened to them?" I asked, keeping my voice calm, even though my heart was racing. Marilyn sighed deeply, as if she needed to gather the strength to continue. "They had problems," she said, her gaze still fixed on the photograph. "Financial problems, marital problems, and when Anna got pregnant, things only got worse. Richard had always been a dreamer, but Anna was practical. She wanted stability, and he didn't know how to give it to her." She paused, her eyes filling with tears. "When Ethan was born, I thought maybe that would bring them together. But it was the opposite. They started fighting more. Anna wrote me letters saying she didn't know how to deal with Richard, that he was becoming more and more distant. And then one day, they just disappeared." My heart sank. The thought of Ethan being left in the hospital because of these circumstances was devastating. "They left Ethan in the hospital?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Marilyn shook her head slowly. "I don't know for sure. The last letter I got was before he was born. Anna said they were moving to try to start over, but they never told me where. After that, nothing. No letter, no call, nothing." She wiped a tear that had run down her cheek, her voice cracking. "For years, I waited for a word, anything to tell me they were okay. When I found out Anna was pregnant, I dreamed of meeting my grandson." Her eyes met mine. "And then you showed up at my door, talking about Ethan. It's like God is giving me a second chance." Her words touched me. It touched me deeply, but it also brought up more questions. What really happened to Richard and Anna? Why had they left Ethan at the hospital and never come back? Were they alive? Had something terrible happened? "He deserves to know," I said finally. "He deserves to know about Richard and Anna, about all of this." Marilyn nodded, determination growing in her eyes. "I want to meet him. I want to be a part of his life, if you'll let me. I can't change the past, but maybe I can help build something for the future." I took her hand across the table. "He'll love meeting you, but we have to be careful. I want to protect him from any more pain." She squeezed my hand tightly. "Thank you, Selena, for everything you've done for him. You're his mother. There's no doubt about that." In that moment, I knew we had something in common, an unconditional love for Ethan and a determination to do what was best for him. The search for answers was far from over, but together, we would take the next steps. The morning was quiet, but my stomach was in knots. Marilyn had agreed to meet Ethan that day, under the guise of being an old family friend. I figured it would be easier for him to process things that way, without the weight of the truth crashing down on him all at once. I spent the night thinking about how this could change our lives, but I didn't have much time to imagine scenarios. The day came too quickly. Marilyn arrived early, carrying a box of homemade cookies and a nervous expression. Her eyes scanned my house as I invited her in. It was her first time here, and I could see her trying to take in the details, probably wondering what life would be like for Ethan in this space. "Is everything okay?" I asked, offering him a cup of tea. "I'm fine, just nervous." She smiled sideways, smoothing her gray hair. "I don't want to scare you. I was nervous too, but I had to stay calm for Ethan. When he came home from school, his heavy backpack dragging on the floor, I hugged him, as I always did, trying to hide my anxiety. "We have a visitor today, honey," I said. "This is Marilyn. She's an old friend of the family." Ethan, with all the curiosity of his 10 years, stared at her for a moment, his eyes scanning her face before he gave her a polite smile. "Hi," he said shyly. "Hi, Ethan," Marilyn replied, her voice soft but thick with emotion. "It's so nice to meet you." They sat in the living room while I got something to drink. I peeked in from the kitchen to see Marilyn leaning over to him, asking about his favorite things. He mentioned the adventure books he loved, and they began talking about stories they read in their spare time. I could see the initial tension between them slowly subsiding, but something was hanging in the air. Marilyn wasn't just curious about Ethan. She was searching for something, some trace of Richard, some sign of connection. After a while, she asked to speak to me alone. We went into the kitchen, leaving Ethan engrossed in a cartoon on the television. "Selena," she began hesitantly, "I have to ask. He seems so different. I mean, I don't see any trace of Richard or Anna in him." The question hung in the air like a heavy cloud. I knew Marilyn wasn't trying to be rude, but her words hit me like a punch. "Marilyn," I began, trying to keep my voice steady. "Ethan is my son. He may not have the features you'd expect, but that doesn't change anything." She nodded, looking regretful. "I'm not questioning it. It's weird, you know. He's nothing like Richard. Not his eyes or his smile." Before I could answer, the doorbell rang. Marilyn and I looked at each other in confusion as I walked to the door. On the other side was a couple I didn't recognize, a tired-looking man and a woman holding a young boy's hand. The resemblance between the boy and Ethan made me pause. "Hi," the man said, his voice hesitant. "My name is Ryan, and this is my wife, Jennifer. We're here about something complicated. It's about Ethan." My heart raced. What else could happen? I invited them in, my hands shaking as I tried to process what they were saying. Ethan appeared in the room, curious, as Ryan and Jennifer explained. "There's something you need to know," Ryan began, looking directly at me. "Mason, our son, was born on the same day as Ethan. We recently found out that the boys had been switched at the hospital." My world stopped. The revelation was so surreal that I could barely process it. Ethan, standing next to me, looked as confused as I felt. Jennifer continued, her eyes filling with tears. "We only found out about this because Mason had to have medical tests, and the results led us to investigate further." She looked at Ethan, then back at me. "We're not here to interrupt your life, Selena. But Mason has a medical condition, and maybe Ethan would be a good match as a donor." The words echoed in my head. Hospital switch, medical condition, my Ethan, our Ethan. None of it made sense. I turned to Marilyn, who was frozen, staring at Mason. She clapped a hand over her mouth, tears streaming down her face. He's just like Richard," she whispered, looking at Mason. The silence in the room was overwhelming. Ethan finally broke the silence with his soft voice. "Mommy, what's going on?" I crouched down, holding her hand. "Ethan, honey, I think we need to talk about some very important things." That moment marked the beginning of a new reality. The connection between our families was more complex than I could have ever imagined. And in that moment, I realized that my life, Ethan's life, and even Marilyn's life were about to change forever. After the shocking revelation, the house went silent, almost as if we were all holding our breath, dreading what was coming next. Ethan sat on the couch, his small hand still wrapped around mine, his eyes looking at me with a mixture of confusion and fear. Mason stood across the room from his parents, his own expression thick with curiosity. They were so alike, yet so different. Jennifer spoke first, her voice soft but hesitant. "Selena, I know this is a shock to everyone, and we don't want to cause any more pain. We just want to understand, and if possible, help Mason." She looked at her son with worried eyes. I wanted to respond, but my mind was a storm. Ethan looked at me, searching for explanations, but I had no words that would ease his confusion. How could I tell him that his life, up until this point, had been built on something so unexpected and complex? "Ethan, dear," I began, choosing my words carefully. "It seems like there was a mistake when you were born. You and Mason, you were switched at the hospital." He blinked, trying to process what I'd said. His fingers tightened around my hand. "What does that mean, Mom?" he asked, his voice thick with vulnerability. I'm not your son?" My heart clenched at the pain in his question. "You're my son, Ethan," I answered quickly, my voice steady even as my heart ached. "Nothing will change that, but biologically, it looks like you're their son." I gestured to Ryan and Jennifer, who watched silently, their eyes filled with a mixture of regret and hope. Ethan was silent for a long moment. He stared at Mason, as if trying to find something familiar in him. "What about you?" he asked, looking directly at Mason. "Did you know about this?" Mason shook his head, looking as lost as Ethan did. "I just found out now," he answered, his voice low. "I didn't know I had a brother, or that we were different." The tension in the room was palpable. Marilyn, who had remained silent until then, stepped forward. Her eyes were fixed on Mason, and she could barely hold back the tears. "Mason, you look so much like Richard, my son," she said, her voice shaking. "I never knew. I never imagined." She turned to Ethan, her eyes welling up. "And Ethan, you're my grandson too. No matter what the blood says, your family." Her words brought a moment of relief, but they also brought more questions. Ethan looked at me again, still trying to process everything. "So, I have two families?" he asked, his voice hesitant. I nodded, squeezing his hand tightly. "Yes, honey. And that means you're even more special, because now you have more people who love you." Jennifer stepped forward, kneeling down to Ethan's level. "We'll never take you away from your mother," she said, tears streaming down her face. "You belong to her, and you always will. We just want to be a part of your life, if you'll let us." Ethan stared at her for a moment, before answering, his voice still shy. "I don't know how to feel about that, but I think I want to get to know you guys." It was at that moment that I realized how strong my son was. Even in the midst of so much turmoil, he was willing to open his heart to the unknown. Ryan cleared his throat, his voice firmer. "We want to get to know you too, Ethan. And if you're willing, we need to talk about something important. Mason has a medical condition, and, well, you might be the only person who can help him." Ethan frowned, but nodded slowly. I want to help. If I can," he said, determination in his voice. I felt a surge of pride mixed with apprehension. My little boy was growing up before my eyes, facing something no child should have to face, but at the same time, I knew he was strong, and, together, we would find a way. That day, something changed in all of us. The connections that had begun to form were fragile, but real. And even with all the doubts and fears, we knew that we had to move forward, together. That night, after everyone had left, I sat on the couch with Ethan. He was quiet, curled up next to me with his head resting on my shoulder. The silence between us was heavy, full of unspoken questions and emotions he didn't yet know how to express. I felt every breath he took, slow and deep, as if he were trying to calm the chaos inside him. "Mommy." He finally broke the silence, his voice low and hesitant. "What's going to happen now?" I looked at him, trying to find the right words. How could I explain that what we had just discovered would change everything, but at the same time nothing, because deep down, he was my son. Nothing could change that. "Well, honey, I guess this means we have more people in our family now," I said, trying to sound optimistic. "And it also means you have a brother." Ethan was quiet for a moment, processing my words. "Mason is my brother, but I'm still your son, right?" he asked, looking at me with uncertain eyes. I cupped his face with both hands, making sure he saw the firmness in my gaze. "Ethan, listen to me carefully. You're my son. Always have been, and always will be. That's never going to change no matter what, okay?" He nodded slowly, and I saw a small relief wash over his face. After he went to bed, I sat alone in the living room, my mind spinning. The revelation about Mason and Ethan had been hard enough, but now Mason's medical condition added another layer of complexity. He needed a compatible donor, and Ethan might be his only hope. The next morning, after I dropped Ethan off at school, I met Ryan and Jennifer at a coffee shop. Marilyn had insisted on coming with me, and I was grateful for her support. She stood next to me, her teacup tightly in her hands, as Ryan and Jennifer explained more about Mason's situation. "He has a rare condition that affects his bone marrow," Jennifer said, her voice shaking. "We've tried to find donors, but so far, nothing. When we found out about Ethan, well, it was like a light at the end of the tunnel." I could feel the weight of guilt and hope in her voice, and it hit me like a wave. Ethan hadn't asked for this. He hadn't asked to be part of a hospital exchange or to be another child's potential savior. He just wanted to be a normal boy. "What if he's not a match?" I asked, my voice coming out harsher than I'd intended. Ryan sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Then we keep looking. But you know, Selena, he might be our best chance. We don't want to force him into anything. We just want to try." Marilyn, who had been silent until that moment, placed her hand over mine. "Selena, I know this is a lot, but if there's a chance we can help Mason, we need to at least consider it. Ethan is strong, and he has you. He's not going to go through this alone." The thought of putting Ethan through any kind of medical procedure terrified me, but I knew they were right. If it could help Mason, it wouldn't be fair to deny him that. When I told Ethan later, he was silent, which worried me. But after a few moments, he looked at me with a maturity that surprised me. "If I can help, I want to, Mom. Mason is my brother, right? I guess that's what brothers do." I hugged him tightly, tears streaming down my face. "You're so brave, Ethan. So much braver than I could ever be." Over the next few days, we began testing. The wait for the results was agonizing, but Ethan handled it all with impressive calm. Each day seemed to bring us closer together as a family, even if in unexpected and complicated ways. Finally, when the results came back, the doctor confirmed that Ethan was a match. The news brought a mixture of relief and anxiety. Now we knew he could help Mason, but it meant going through a procedure that would be difficult for any child. That night, as he tucked him into bed, he held my hand and whispered, "It's going to be okay, Mommy. I know it will." And in that moment, I realized that even in the face of all this, Ethan had a strength I could never have imagined. He was willing to do whatever it took to help someone he barely knew, but already considered a part of his life. And so we prepared ourselves for what was to come, knowing that despite all the challenges, we would face it together, as a true family. The morning of the surgery came sooner than I expected. Ethan seemed calm, but I could see the anxiety in his eyes. I tried to do the same, but my mind was a whirlwind of what-ifs. He was about to face something too big for a child his age, and I felt torn between pride and fear. "Mommy, I'm going to be okay," he said, holding my hand as we walked down the hospital hallway. I smiled at him, even though inside all I wanted to do was pick him up and run. "I know, honey. You're the strongest boy I know," I said, stroking his face. Ryan and Jennifer were there too, with Mason beside them. Mason looked nervous, but there was also something in his eyes, a gratitude he couldn't quite put into words. He looked at Ethan, who gave him a calm smile. "We're going to be okay," Ethan said, almost as if he were the one comforting Mason, not the other way around. The procedure had been long, or at least it felt that way. Marilyn stood beside me in the waiting room, her hands holding mine tightly. The wait had tested my patience and sanity. Every time the door opened, my heart raced, but the doctor didn't come in until hours later, with a reassuring smile. It was a success. "They're both fine. Ethan is recovering and will be able to see you soon." The tears came before I could even answer him. Marilyn hugged me, and I felt the weight of weeks of anxiety begin to lift. When I finally walked into Ethan's room, he was awake, looking exhausted but smiling. He was holding one of his drawings, an elephant he'd scribbled before the procedure. It seemed to me a perfect metaphor for his strength. "Hi, Mommy," he said, his voice soft but full of joy. "Hi, my hero," I replied, sitting next to him and holding his hand. The next day, Mason came into Ethan's room, still moving slowly, but with a shy smile on his face. He was holding a drawing he'd made for Ethan, a giraffe, a little crooked but full of color. "Thank you for helping me," Mason said, handing him the paper. Ethan smiled, looking at the drawing. "We're brothers, right? That's what we do." The days that followed were a whirlwind of emotions. Ryan and Jennifer started visiting more often, and our families began to develop a strange but welcoming routine. Visits to the park were times of laughter, where Ethan and Mason ran together as if they'd been raised side by side since the beginning. Jennifer and I started talking more, swapping stories about our sons and trying to bridge the gap that the hospital exchange had created. It wasn't always easy. There were times when the weight of the past still hung over us, but there was also a quiet determination to make it work. "You're an amazing mother, Selena," Jennifer said to me one night as we watched the boys play in the backyard. "I know this isn't easy, but I'm so grateful for everything you've done, not just for Ethan, but for Mason too." I smiled, feeling a surge of emotion. I only want the best for them, for all of us. Marilyn became a constant presence in our lives, offering her unconditional support and love. She helped with the boys, teaching them about Richard and Anna, but always being careful not to overwhelm them. For her, this time with Ethan and Mason was a second chance, something she treasured deeply. One day, as I watched Ethan and Mason drawing together at the living room table, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time: peace. It wasn't the life I had imagined when I brought Ethan home, but it was our life now, full of challenges, but also full of love. And in the end, that was all that mattered. The sun was setting, casting a golden light through the living room windows. Ethan and Mason were on the floor, surrounded by puzzle pieces, laughing and exchanging friendly banter over who would find the last piece. I watched them from the couch, my heart filled with something that seemed so close to complete happiness. It hadn't been easy getting here. Each step of this journey had brought a different challenge. The exchange at the hospital, the discovery about Mason, the surgery, and the difficult conversations with Ethan about his biological origins, all seemed so distant now, but at the same time, so present in our hearts. Mason found the last piece of the puzzle and fit it together with a smile of triumph. Ethan rolled his eyes dramatically and then burst into laughter, infecting Mason. It was such a pure and infectious sound that it made me smile, feeling a pride that almost hurt. Marilyn came into the room with a tray of freshly baked cookies. She watched the boys with a soft smile, sitting down next to me. Her eyes were fixed on Mason, but there was a peace in her expression that I hadn't seen in a long time. "They're okay, aren't they?" Marilyn asked, breaking the silence. "Yes," I said. "They are. And so are we, I think." She nodded, her eyes wide, glistening with tears she hadn't let fall. "Thank you, Selena, for everything, for taking care of Ethan, for bringing Mason into our lives. I couldn't have asked for more." I took his hand, squeezing it lightly. "They're my family, Marilyn. I would do it all over again, no matter how hard it was." That night, after everyone had gone to bed, I went to Ethan's room. He was already in bed, but he was still holding the drawing Mason had given him after his surgery. I sat beside him, running my fingers through his hair. "Mommy," he murmured, his voice sleepy. "Yes, my love. I like having Mason around, but you'll always be my mom no matter what." My eyes filled with tears, but I smiled. "Always, Ethan. You'll always be my son, and I'll always be your mom. Nothing in the world can change that." He closed his eyes, and I stood there for a moment, watching him breathe softly. When I left the room, I felt lighter than I had in months. The days that followed brought a new normal. Mason and Ethan became inseparable, as if they had always been brothers. Ryan and Jennifer became more present in our lives, and little by little, we became something that felt more like a family. It wasn't conventional, but it was ours, and it felt good. I learned that family isn't just about blood. It's about choice, about love, about being there for others, even when it's hard. The story of Ethan, Mason, and all of us wasn't perfect, but it was real. And in the end, that's what matters. The love we built together was stronger than any challenge, and as unexpected as it was, I found peace knowing that we were exactly where we were meant to be together,